Have a great deal to say.
The House is gaveling back in, so we'll leave this. A reminder, you can always see Washington Journal live weekdays at 7 a.m. Eastern. The House taking up several bills today. Votes at 6:30 Eastern. Now live to the House floor here on C-SPAN.
Phone questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 185.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
House Calendar Number 57, H.R. 185, a bill to designate the United States Courthouse located at 101 East Pecan Street in Sherman, Texas, as the Paul Brown United States Courthouse.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Barletta, and the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Carson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 185.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
H.R. 185 would designate the United States Courthouse located at 101 East Pecan Street in Sherman, Texas, as the Paul Brown United States Courthouse. During World War II, Judge Paul Brown enlisted in the United States Navy. In 1950, he graduated from the University of Texas School of Law and started a law practice in Sherman, Texas. In 1953, he served as an assistant United States attorney for the Eastern District of Texas and later as the United States Attorney. In 1985, he was appointed by President Ronald Reagan to serve as district judge for the Eastern District of Texas. He served as a district judge and then as a senior district judge until his death in 2012. I want to thank the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall, for his leadership on this legislation. I think it is fitting to honor the service of Judge Brown to this nation by naming this courthouse after him. I support passage of this legislation. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 185, which designates the United States Courthouse in Sherman, Texas, as the Paul Brown United States Courthouse. Judge Brown was a highly respected member not only of the federal judicial community, but also in the Sherman, Texas community. After serving in the U.S. Navy in World War II, he returned to Texas to continue his education and received his law degree from the University of Texas Law School in 1950. In 1953, Mr. Speaker, he was appointed as an assistant United States attorney for the Eastern District of Texas. In 1959, President Eisenhower appointed Judge Brown as the United States attorney in the Eastern District, where he served until 1961. He returned to private practice in Sherman from 1961 to 1985 and enjoyed a reputation as an outstanding civil litigation lawyer. President Reagan later nominated him to become a federal judge in the Eastern District of Texas in 1985. Judge Brown presided over cases that involved bank and savings and loans failures of the 1980s and early 1990s, as well as many intellectual property and patent cases. Judge Brown was also a prominent member of the community, serving as board member of Medical Plaza Hospital, president of the Sherman School Board, and president of the Optimist Club of Sherman. Judge Brown assumed senior status in April 2001 and later died in 2006 after 21 years of distinguished service on the federal bench. This designation is a fitting tribute to his career as a veteran and respected jurist. I urge my colleagues to join us in supporting H.R. 185. Mr. Speaker, I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too rise in support of H.R. 185. As has been stated, a bill designating the United States Courthouse located at 101 East Pecan Street in Sherman, Texas as the Paul Brown United States Courthouse. Judge Brown was an outstanding federal judge who passed away on November 26, 2012, after 21 years of very distinguished service. Judge Brown was my good friend, a respected judge, and beloved member of Sherman, Texas community. Judge Brown represented the finest qualities of jurisprudence. Hanging on his wall in the Sherman Federal Courthouse was Socrates' 4 qualities for a good judge: to hear courteously, to answer wisely, to consider soberly, and to decide impartially. Judge Brown embodied all of these qualities, and he dispensed justice accordingly. He was highly regarded, well respected, and was a role for many. Judge Brown was the youngest of a family of 6 raised on a farm in Pottsboro, Texas. He graduated from Denison High School, and although underage, he was able to get his parents' consent to join the United States Navy when World War II broke out. He served as a minesweeper in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters and as a part of the occupation forces in Japan. He was discharged as an electrician's mate, 2nd class in June 1946. He returned to his studies and received a law degree in 1950 from the University of Texas before being called active duty in the Korean War. He saw combat aboard a minesweeper which was sunk by mines. He received an honorable discharge in December 1951. Judge Brown worked as an assistant U.S. attorney in Texarkana under U.S. Attorney William Steger, who would become his mentor, good friend, and eventually fellow colleague on the bench. He served as assistant U.S. attorney from 1953 to 1959, and then followed in Judge Steger's footsteps as U.S. District Attorney from 1959 to 1961. While in Texarkana, he met and married Frances Moorhead, and the two returned home to Sherman, where he practiced law for a number of years. In 1985, Senator Phil Gramm recommended him to President Reagan for a new judge's position created by the Eastern District of Texas, and he was confirmed that year. He held court in Beaumont Parish, Sherman, and Texarkana, and as the caseload in Sherman grew, he eventually presided over the Sherman Courthouse exclusively. Premier cases over the years included intellectual property, patent cases, and criminal cases precipitated by the bank and savings and loan failures in the 1980s and 1990s. In recent years, he noted the increase in the drug cases and expressed his regret that, in spite of all the efforts that have been made to prosecute drug dealers, the nation is not making much progress in curtailing the use of drugs. No matter what type of cases came before him, Judge Brown always enjoyed the work and ran an efficient and orderly courtroom. His personal ethics and judicial integrity were remarkable, and his reputation for punctuality is legendary. Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues to join me in celebrating the life of a great American, outstanding public servant, and respected jurist. The bill has the support of the federal judges in the Eastern District, and I ask for your support of 185 to designate the U.S. Courthouse in Sherman, Texas, the Paul Brown United States Courthouse. Thank you, and I do yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Indiana has already yielded back.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 185? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
I demand the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2083 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2083, a bill to amend the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 to require criminal background checks for school employees.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Akita, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on H.R. 2083.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2083, the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, a report released by the Government Accountability Office in December 2010 examined 15 cases where individuals with histories of sexual misconduct were hired or retained as teachers, support staff, volunteers, and contractors. In 11 of these 15 cases, those individuals had previously targeted children. Despite the fact that states have varying policies intended to protect children from sexual predators in schools, the GAO determined the policies were largely inconsistent and insufficient. According to the report, states don't consistently perform pre-employment background checks, and when they do conduct these checks, they are not always fingerprinted or connected to the National Criminal Database. There was widespread agreement on both sides of this aisle that more must be done to protect students. We have worked with our colleagues to advance legislation that will ensure that every school employee, from the cafeteria workers, Mr. Speaker, to the administrators, to the janitors, to the teachers, principals, and librarians, that everyone is subject to a complete background check that includes the FBI fingerprint identification system and the National Sex Offender Registry. Now today, we have an opportunity to finish the fight by sending this bill, the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act, to the Senate. H.R. 2083 will require states that receive funds under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to have policies and practices in place that ensure each school employee is subject to a complete national criminal background check. Now, Mr. Speaker, a similar provision was offered by 2 of my colleagues and good friends, both from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick and Mr. Meehan. And that provision was included in the House-passed Student Success Act from last month. The Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act is common-sense legislation that will help ensure students in schools across the country to ensure that they're safe from sexual criminals. So, all that being said, Mr. Speaker, I simply urge at this time my colleagues to support H.R. 2083, and I will reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I want to thank Mr. Akita for presenting the bill and Mr. Fitzpatrick for their work on the legislation. I appreciate their assistance. Mr. Speaker, when parents send their children to school each morning, they expect that they would come home safe from harm. Day in and day out, millions of teachers, staff, and administrators do their utmost, sometimes in downright heroic ways, to put their students' safety first. But despite these efforts, there remains a steady stream of stories from across the country involving students who have been abused by someone in a position of trust in the schools. Just this past summer, a music teacher in Silver Spring, Maryland elementary school was found to have sexually abused 15 minors over an 8-year period. In my home state of California, a teacher was convicted of throwing a 5-year-old boy with a disability to the classroom floor and kicking him, and was transferred to another school for the following year, but not fired because due to illegal limitations. The superintendent of the school district acknowledged that police were not informed after that horrible incident. To make matters worse, even after her conviction, this person was allowed to keep a desk job through the rest of the school year, still had her credential, and simply moved to a new school to teach, putting more children at risk. We should be doing everything we can to prevent these abuses. The very fundamental place to start is to not employ predators in our school in the first place. After I requested an investigation in 2010, the Government Accountability Office office uncovered a wide range of cases in numerous states of convicted sex offenders who had previously targeted children working in schools side by side with those children. In some cases, these schools had unknowingly hired a sex offender. This happened because the state laws were inconsistent with how they require schools to conduct background checks of their employees and what types of crimes are covered. In other cases, the General Accounting Office found that districts knowingly passed on a potential predator and abuser to another school or school district, allowing the offender to resign instead of reporting him. Although every state requires some background checks, the checks are not always thorough. GAO found that in some states require only checks of licensed teachers, but not other employees, and some states don't require criminal history checks of contractors at public schools. The GAO also found that at least half of the states lack any rules to ensure that child abuse allegations are not suppressed by school officials, and only a few states require schools to conduct recurring background checks on employees. The significant differences in the way schools screen prospective employees leads to gaps in student protection. But a child's safety shouldn't depend on the state in which they reside. A patchwork of state laws fails to protect all children. That's simply not good enough. We need a minimum national standards to keep children safe from sexual predators and other violent adults. That's why I'm proud to be the author of the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act, along with my co-sponsors. This bill closes the loopholes. It would create consistency across states' background check policy, requiring public schools to conduct comprehensive background checks for any employees or applicants for employment with unsupervised access to children, using state criminal and child abuse registries and the FBI's fingerprint database, as well as to periodically update these checks. Contractors in public schools with unsupervised access to students are also subject to these same background checks under this bill. It would prohibit school districts from hiring or retaining anyone who has been convicted of certain violent crimes, including crimes against children, crimes involving rape or sexual assault, or child pornography. Schools must be a place where faculty and students can focus on teaching and learning without fear of emotional or physical harm. Keeping students safe requires a coordinated effort from teachers, principals, superintendents, community partners, and parents. The vast majority of school staff is trustworthy and works hard every day to support students' learning needs. I honor and respect their work, which is so central to the success of this nation. The criminal background checks required in H.R. 2083 are essential to ensuring that schools and school districts are doing everything they can to protect children. Mr. Speaker, keeping children safe isn't a partisan issue, it's a moral obligation. And that's why I'm pleased to see the strong bipartisan support from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle of this legislation. I want to thank the co-sponsors in particular, Mr. Fitzpatrick, Mr. Stivers, Ms. McCarthy, Ms. Slaughter, Ms. Wilson, Mr. Rangel, Mr. Holt, and Mr. Cohn. And working with Chairman Klein and with Mr. Rokita's staff, we have clarified several provisions from the original bill that I introduced in May, including the states must periodically repeat and update background checks on employees based upon state and local policy that is publicly transparent. School districts may share background check results with each other for the same employee. School employees could appeal the results of a background check if it's inaccurate or incomplete and establish their employment eligibility if the check was corrected. This bill is only as good as the quality of the background checks, and I will work with my colleagues to address issues related to ensuring that the checks are complete and accurate. Congressman Ellison and Congressman Bobby Scott have introduced legislation that seeks to support this goal, and I will work with them and others to see this important worker protection if the bill moves forward in the Senate. I want to thank again Chairman Klein for his working on the sensible solutions that will protect children across the country, and I also want to thank the respective staffs for their diligence and thoughtfulness in helping us to develop and move this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the chairman, Mr. Rokita, and I rise in strong support of the legislation on the floor today. It's a bill which, if passed by the House and carried by the Senate to the President, will go a long way toward protecting students in our nation's schools. And so I thank the ranking member, Mr. Miller, for bringing this bill up today and for bringing to light an issue that is compromising student safety throughout our country. H.R. 2083, the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act of 2013, will ensure consistent and comprehensive school employee background checks in all states. The bill also includes language from a bill I introduced, the Jeremy Bell Act. This piece of the larger bill blocks federal funding to schools that knowingly hire or transfer teachers involved in sexual misconduct. The Jeremy Bell Act is named after a 12-year-old West Virginia elementary school student who was sexually abused and murdered by his principal, a man that had a long record of sexual misconduct, but who was allowed to transfer and leave schools without punishment and without informing new districts. In the 2010 Government Accountability Office investigations report, it was found that inconsistent state laws regarding background checks facilitated the hiring and transferring of sexual predators in our schools. If, by cutting off funds to schools that knowingly pass the trash, we can save one student from Jeremy's fate, then this bill has succeeded. Overall, this bipartisan bill includes student safety measures, including requiring background checks for school employees, a common-sense method to better protect our children in their schools. In testimony submitted to a field hearing I held in Philadelphia last Congress, Roy Bell, Jeremy's father, expressed his outrage and his sadness that our education system had failed to protect the life and innocence of his 12-year-old son. Unfortunately, Jeremy's father passed away this weekend, and it is on his behalf and on behalf of all parents and students that I will continue to work to pass legislation that protects our students. And so today I ask my colleagues to consider this legislation and its impact on families across our nation. Mr. Speaker, I encourage quick passage of H.R. 2083 by both chambers and to be signed into law by the President. I thank the Chairman and I thank Mr. Miller for his work on this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I want to thank the gentleman, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for his comments and for his support of this legislation. We had a couple of other speakers that are supposedly coming to the floor. Do you have anybody? No. Well, then I guess...
Does the gentleman reserve, or does the gentleman yield?
I guess I have to yield back.
From Indiana is recognized.
I'll yield back the balance of my time to the gentleman.
You do.
I thank the gentleman. I thank the Speaker. Yield myself the remainder of the time on our side.
Gentleman is recognized.
Go ahead. Well, please.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California has already yielded back.
Do you have anything written that I haven't seen it?
Does the gentleman from California ask unanimous consent to reclaim?
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota.
The gentleman from California, ask unanimous consent.
Yes, I do. I ask unanimous
to reclaim
consent
the remainder
of your time. On Mr. Ellison's speedy arrival here.
Is there objection?
Without objection.
Thank you.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to recognize that all of us who are parents or members of Congress, or no matter what walk of life we may travel in, want to make sure that our children are safe, are well taken care of, and that the people who care for them at their school are qualified to do so and don't present a danger to them. At the same time, I think it's important that we recognize that when we put barriers to employment that are lifetime bans, that are not sensitive to certain realities as it relates to people overcoming criminal backgrounds, and when we put prophylactic rules that don't account for particular offenses in a nuanced way, we do run the risk of doing a good thing, but doing too much of a thing and thereby leading to some unexpected and unwanted results. I've had the privilege of talking to Ranking Member Miller about some concerns I have about the bill before us today. I think that the concerns are well within Mr. Miller's frame of mind, and he and I have talked, and he's indicated to me that he's willing to work with me to refine the bill to the degree that we can ensure the protection and safety of our children at school, but at the same time make sure that we don't set up precedents that create unwarranted and unnecessary barriers to employment. At this time, I don't think I need to go into the details of each of those. Suffice it to say that if the gentleman would agree that we did talk and we're going to work together on refining the bill as best we can, I'd appreciate that.
If the gentleman would yield, I would say that I spoke to you this morning, and we will obviously continue to work with you. We've tried to draw the line at serious felony violent crimes that people had participated in with respect to the ban. In terms of a drug arrest or whatever, there's a 5-year window that we've started, and we'll be glad to continue that conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I also just want to point out that we have talked about inaccurate information, and it's important that we make sure the records we're using are the right records and accurate records.
Gentleman's time has expired.
If the gentleman would just yield for 2 seconds, and that's why an appeals process is included in this legislation. Thank you.
And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the remainder of our side's time.
Gentleman is recognized.
And just to clarify, Mr. Speaker, the gentleman on the other side has no further speakers and has yielded the remainder.
I have no further speakers now.
Gentleman from California yield back?
Yes, I yield back at this time.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman. I thank the Speaker. Today's debate has only underscored, again, the importance of moving forward with this sensible and responsible legislation. Not only will the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act ensure all school employees undergo a complete background check, it will also help states implement policies and practices that prohibit the hiring of anyone who refuses to consent to a background check, makes a false statement in connection with the check, or has been convicted of a violent or sexual crime against a child. There is absolutely no reason we shouldn't all stand united in support of this critical legislation. So once again, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 2083, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2083 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the title is amended. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3205.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3205, a bill to reauthorize and restructure the Adoption Incentives Grant Program and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Reichert, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on the subject of the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge support for H.R. 3205, the Promoting Adoption and Legal Guardianship for Children in Foster Care Act. Now, obviously, I look old enough to be a grandfather, and I am a grandfather, a proud grandfather of 6. But 2 of my grandchildren are adopted grandchildren. Now, I was a foster grandfather. My daughter and her husband were foster parents for a while, and they ended up finding 2 children that they really wanted to include as part of their family. And these 2 children today are 9 and 10, and soon to be 10 and 11 here in the next few months. They were 3 months old when they came into the house as foster kids, and now are adopted and a part of not only my daughter and her husband's family, but a part of the entire family, the Reichert household, has been blessed with their presence. And they have a hope for a successful future with a loving family. And this is what this bill is all about, to encourage parents across this country to adopt foster children. But I also had the opportunity as the sheriff in King County and as a detective in King County to watch from a very close-up view of what foster homes look like. As I walked into those homes as a police officer, as a detective, and questioned how some of these places could even be foster homes. And foster kids running away from home and ending up on the street and not having a place to call their own, not having a place where they could go to have Thanksgiving, to have Christmas, bouncing from one foster home to the next, not knowing who to call, mom or dad. We've got to fix that. We need to encourage parents across this country to adopt our foster children, to give them that opportunity. The other good thing about this bill is bipartisan. So in fact, I can't think of a more important or more bipartisan topic than promoting adoption for our children. That's why we're here today. This is an era where both parties have worked together to improve outcomes for children, and it's been working. In the 10 years from 1987 through 1997, the number of children in foster care rose dramatically, climbing from 300,000 to 537,000. That surge in foster care caseloads is one of the reasons why Congress, led by the current Ways and Means Chairman Dave Camp, passed the Adoption and Safe Families Act in 1997. That law was designed to ensure more foster children were quickly adopted when they couldn't return and live safely with their parents. The Adoption Incentives Program, created as a part of that law, was one key measure to encourage more adoptions of children from foster care. In short, it rewards states if they increase the number of children living in foster care for adoptive homes. It worked since the passage of the Adoption and Safe Families Act. Foster care caseloads have fallen dramatically. After peaking at 567,000 in 1999, foster care caseloads have fallen almost 30%. At the same time, adoptions from foster care increased in the late 90s and remained much higher than before the 1997 law's passage. Now, today we are here to support H.R. 3205, the Promoting Adoption and Legal Guardianship for Children in Foster Care, which will build upon the successes of the Adoption Incentives Program. This legislation extends that program and improves the way we reward states that help more children leave foster care for loving adoptive homes. First, it improves the formulas behind these awards to make sure that even as foster care caseloads continue to come down, states continue to get awards for moving children into adoptive homes. Second, it continues to promote the type of adoptions that have proven hardest to achieve by adding a special award for the adoption of teenage children. We should never give up on trying to find lifelong homes for these children, and this legislation steps up the incentives for states to do just that. And third, we add a new award for guardianship, which is an important development in the child welfare world that is allowing thousands of children to leave foster care and live safely with relatives. This bill also requires states to focus funds on post-adoption services, which help children and families after adoptions have been finalized. And finally, the bill would extend for 3 years the Family Connection Grant Program that is focused on helping children in foster care reconnect with family members. Because funding for that program needs to be offset, we included a common sense pay-for, which builds on a current procedure for recovering overpayments of unemployment insurance benefits. Under current law, states may offset federal income tax refunds to collect these overpayments and 2/3 of states do that today. This legislation would require all states to use this procedure, which will increase overpayment recovery and results in this legislation reducing the deficit by $24 million over the next 10 years. As chairman of the Ways and Means Human Resources Subcommittee with jurisdiction over this program, I'm pleased to report that the process behind developing this bill has been totally bipartisan and open. First, we held a subcommittee hearing in February featuring nonpartisan experts on adoption and child welfare. Then we worked together with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to develop draft legislation, which was made publicly available in early August. We then worked together to incorporate that public feedback, improving in many ways the legislation that Chairman Camp and I and Ranking Members Levin and Doggett introduced on September 27th. I want to thank the subcommittee's ranking member, Mr. Doggett, who joins me on the floor this evening, as well as our chairman, Mr. Camp, and ranking member, Mr. Levin, for their support of this legislation and for their help throughout this development. This will move us a step forward to closer and closer to ensuring that more children living in the United States live in permanent, loving homes and receive the support they deserve. I invite all members to join us in supporting this important bipartisan legislation and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Reichert, Chairman Camp. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, abused and neglected children in the foster care system are among the most vulnerable children in our communities. These children have the same needs, desires, and dreams as all young people. They need a safe and loving home. They want and deserve the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to fully experience life. A successful adoption provides foster children with these necessities and gives them the opportunity to achieve their full God-given potential. Investing in the success of our foster children is not only good for them, but in so many communities, it's the difference between those young people becoming a community asset and a community liability. It's about reducing future unemployment, homelessness, teen pregnancy, and incarceration. This bill contributes to our continuing efforts to address these issues and to provide permanent homes for abused and neglected children. I'm pleased that Mr. Levin and I could work with Chairman Camp, Chairman Reichert, to develop this bipartisan legislation to not only extend some important programs, but to make a number of positive changes. Mr. Reichert has outlined some of these. I would add attention to a provision that I authored to help ensure that children don't lose assistance simply because their guardian dies. As a longtime member of the Congressional Coalition on Adoption and a member of the Foster Youth Caucus, I am pleased that we could take these steps in the right direction on a bipartisan basis to help these young people. The legislation both continues and improves the incentives now provided to the states when they increase the rate at which foster children who cannot return home find an adoptive family. These new incentives will now be even more focused on the promotion of adoption of older foster children who are sometimes a bit more difficult to place and who have found difficulty in securing a permanent home. Additionally, for the first time, the bill will reward states for helping youth leave foster care to live with a permanent legal guardian. Recognizing the importance of maintaining the link between family and children in foster care, the legislation also extends a relatively new but expiring program known as the Family Connection Grants. These grants go out on a competitive basis to local organizations and state agencies to support various approaches for improving connections between foster families and their children, including linking grandparents to supports and services when they become the primary caregivers for children who would otherwise be in foster care. Another provision that I care about greatly is strengthening of the requirement that adoption funding be spent on promoting adoption rather than being diverted to other purposes. Most notably, this legislation requires states to fully reinvest the funds into post-adoption services and other child welfare activities when these amounts were made available by an increase in federal funding for adoption support. In total, this legislation will continue the progress we've made over the last 15 years in moving foster children into permanent homes. In my home state of Texas, San Antonio has been viewed as a particular model of success for adoption. Each month, Bexar County hosts an Adoption Day event that allows families to complete their adoptions in a single day. These are proceedings that have allowed children to have shorter stays in foster care and to move more quickly into stable homes. Judges in Bexar County understand that they're responsible for getting children who experience abuse and neglect into a safe foster environment and responsible for placing that child with a permanent family if it does not become safe for the child to return home. These improvements in the local adoption system have been encouraged and utilized by important local child advocates like District Judge Peter Sakai and Casa San Antonio. They've allowed for faster and more efficient placement of foster youth into permanent families. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this bipartisan effort, and I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield as much time as he may consume to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Camp.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. I want to thank the chairman of the Human Resources Subcommittee for yielding and for his leadership on this very important issue. I rise in support of this legislation, which is designed to encourage the adoption of more children from foster care. I spent much of my career promoting adoption of children by loving parents because every child deserves a loving and safe home. As an attorney in private practice, I worked with parents and children in the foster care system. Those sorts of experiences provided much of the background for changes in landmark adoption legislation I and my colleagues on the Ways and Means Committee crafted in 1997, called the Adoption and Safe Families Act. That legislation streamlined the adoption process to help more children in foster care quickly move into permanent adoptive homes. It also for the first time offered incentives to states to safely increase the number of children adopted from foster care. It worked. In the decade following that legislation, the number of U.S. children adopted from foster care increased by 71%. In the years since, adoptions have continued to remain higher even as the foster care caseload started to decline. Overall, almost 300 children have been adopted as a result of the increases in adoptions since 1997. One study even estimated that the federal government saved $1 billion over 8 years by ensuring children were adopted instead of remaining in foster care. That's the successful incentive program this legislation extends and updates. We add a new award for states that increase adoptions of older children who are the hardest to adopt and have the worst outcomes if they emancipate from foster care without a family to call their own. We also add a new award for increases in guardianship when family members step up to care for their nieces and nephews, grandsons and granddaughters. And this bill ensures states maintain their commitment to post-adoption related services so that children may truly have a family forever. I noted that this legislation is fully paid for by a simple and real reform, requiring states to reduce federal income tax refunds when someone wrongly gets an overpayment for unemployment benefits. Those savings not only cover the cost of this legislation, but reduce the deficit by $24 million over the next 10 years. That's a win-win for children, for families, and taxpayers alike. The bottom line is this: children in foster care deserve a place to call home, not just for a few months or years, but for good. We've already seen great progress in increasing adoption since the Adoption Incentive Program was created in 1997, and it's our hope that we can continue this progress with this bill. I thank my colleagues who joined me in introducing this legislation, Mr. Levin of Michigan, Mr. Reichert of Washington State, and Mr. Doggett of Texas. They are all leaders on these issues in the committee and this House, and I value their help in developing and advancing this legislation. I would also like to recognize the public comment we received in crafting this bill. A draft bill was posted on the Ways and Means Committee's website in August, and the public was given a month to provide their thoughts on how to ensure more children are adopted. The bill we're considering today incorporates many of those suggestions, and we're grateful for the public's comments and their participation in this process. I encourage all of my colleagues to join us in supporting this bill in the House, and I hope the Senate will act as soon as they can so we can continue to move even more children from foster care into permanent, loving homes. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, surely no member of the House has expressed more interest in this subject than the founder of the Foster Youth Caucus, our colleague from California, Ms. Bass, to whom I yield 3 minutes.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member Doggett. I rise today in support of the Promoting Adoption and Legal Guardianship for Children in Foster Care Act. First, I'd like to commend Chairman Camp and Chairman Reichert and Ranking Members Levin and Doggett for their great work on this legislation and their ongoing commitment to our nation's foster youth. As the co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Foster Youth and the Congressional Caucus on Adoption, I sincerely appreciate your leadership and partnership on this issue. Since 1997, when the adoption incentives legislation became law, we have seen a significant reduction of the number of kids in foster care and, more importantly, an increased number of kids in forever families. Yet there are still over 400,000 children in our nation's child welfare system, many awaiting the stability and love of a permanent family. Unfortunately, studies show that a foster youth, especially those who age out, are much more likely to experience poverty, unemployment, homelessness, incarceration, and compromised health after they leave foster care. Each year, nearly 30,000 teenagers age out of foster care without a permanent family. We know that this is unfair and unacceptable. We must strengthen policies that help to find forever families for our nation's foster children, especially our older youth. I'd like to focus my remarks on one of the noteworthy aspects of the bill, the enhanced support for legal guardianship. By making this investment, we will ultimately help more kids find permanent families, often with relatives. Today's foster care system looks much different than the child welfare system of previous decades. While children continue to be placed in foster homes with strangers or in group homes, more than half are placed with a relative caregiver, a grandmother, aunt, uncle, or older sibling. In fact, in my district in Los Angeles, relative caregivers are the largest foster care providers. Research shows that foster placement with relatives are good for children. They often allow children to stay in their schools, receive continued support from their community and culture, and feel connected to families that continue to love them. Despite the importance of relative caregivers, they face unique obstacles. Becoming a caregiver changes lives in every way, physically, emotionally, and financially. Stable middle-class families or seniors who live on their life savings are often pushed to the brink of poverty because they have accepted the unexpected financial burden of caring for a child. As a nation, we should take the extra steps needed to support family members that heroically step up to care for children in times of need. Additionally, I strongly support the Family Connection grants reauthorized in this bill. These grants help to strengthen families, support kinship care, and prevent youth from entering or re-entering foster care. Before my time in elected office, I was honored to advocate for kinship and guardianship resources alongside relative caregivers at the Community Coalition's Kinship in Action program. Today, I'm greatly encouraged that the bill before us encourages permanent families of all kinds, supporting both adoption and guardianship throughout the nation. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this bipartisan legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, a distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Young.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nearly 3,000 Hoosier children are currently eligible for adoption while living in foster care. Now, I know all of us can agree that these children, the over 100,000 children in the United States eligible for adoption, deserve a stable, permanent, and loving home. While there's no doubt our foster care programs provide an essential service, I strongly believe, as a proud father of 4 young children and as someone who used to provide free legal services to those wanting to adopt, that there can be no substitute for the care a loving family can provide. Whether it's living with a family member or being adopted into a new family, we must do everything in our powers to see that children everywhere receive the best upbringing possible. This legislation represents a step forward in finding these children caring and supportive homes. By extending the Adoption Incentives Program, we effectively encourage and incentivize states to help adopt more children out of foster care so these children can lead happy, healthy, and successful lives. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I would yield 3 minutes to my colleague from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
The Speaker asks to address the House, revise, and extend.
Without objection.
Unanimous consent. Let me thank the managers of this bill, gentleman from Washington and the gentleman from Texas, my colleague from, we would say on the floor, the great state of Texas. This is a very important measure that I've had an opportunity to engage in. A couple of years back, I would say more years than I'd like to remember, former Congressman Mike Andrews and myself were co-chairs of the Foster Grandparents Program in Houston. And it drew me to the importance of both foster care and adoption. I've also spent some time with Senator Mary Landrieu, who, as many know, is a very strong advocate of the idea of adoption and legal guardianship for children on foster care. One of the new phenomenons that we are seeing more and more is the phenomenon of aging out for foster care children. And so I rise today to support H.R. 3205 and compliment the co-chairs of the Foster Care Caucus, of which I'm a member, Congresswoman Bass and Chairman Co-Chair Marino, and really ask my colleagues to support this important initiative. I'm very proud to co-sponsor this legislation, and as a co-chair and founder of the Congressional Children's Caucus, now almost 20 years, I'd like to say I strongly support it. The more times that we can say something positive about children in a bipartisan way on the floor of the House, the more of a national statement and commitment is seen by those who are in the various vineyards in our states and county government and city government who work every day to protect our children. Foster care serves our children and families in a temporary placement by providing suitable permanent living. Most children are placed in foster care temporarily due to parental abuse or neglect. In Harris County, my county in Texas, 2,388 children were taken into protective custody in 2011. The average number of children in foster care each month in Harris County is 5,300. 2,444 children in Children's Protective Service custody are placed in permanent living in Harris County in 2011. This is the right direction to go. As of September 30th, 2012, 1,740 children in the Houston region are still waiting to be adopted. And on average, children stay in the system for almost 3 years before either being reunited with their families or adopted. What a wonderful statement to know that there are families or adults that love you. Many times those adoptions are amongst family members. Many times the grandparents take the children. Let's thank them, because that's the program I was involved in, to give R&R rest to the grandparents who are forced to care for many, many children. Frequent moves, different schools, our children need loving care. They need stability, and many times these foster parents provide that kind of stability. Many foster children have been separated not only from their parents but from their siblings, and this can be very detrimental socially, emotionally, and
time has
psychologically.
expired.
Get an extra minute or two.
We'll yield the gentlewoman an additional 30 seconds.
Without objection.
And so this legislation, which reauthorizes and restructures the Adoption Incentive Grant Program, will help enhance, cultivate, and advance the foster care system by making it a program that is beneficial. Mr. Speaker, I was not able to come to the floor for H.R. 2083. I also, as a co-chair of the Congressional Children's Caucus focusing on the abuse of children, want to salute and support Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act and ask this floor to support both of these initiatives, because when we speak for children, we speak for America. I hope that we will also see soon an anti-bullying and prevention legislation on the floor, Mr. Speaker, to make that public statement. I thank the gentleman for his yielding, and I want to salute little Audrey's in Houston for the work they have done for the children in Houston, Texas. Thank you, Alma, very much for the work you do. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Speaker, hopefully the Senate will respond to our strong show of bipartisan support by moving this legislation this year, and with that, I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record letters of support for this legislation from Christian Heritage Center for Family Finding and Youth Connectedness, Seneca Family of Agencies, the Donaldson Adoption Institute, Hillside Family of Agencies, and Voice for Adoption.
Without objection.
And I want to echo the words of Mr. Doggett. I hope that the Senate does act on this. There are three things that I'd like to just highlight as we wrap up this evening's discussion on foster care. Three things that this bill does. One, it cuts the deficit. Two, amazingly, in this time of partisanship, this is a true bipartisan moment that we all ought to stop, pause, and take recognition of. This is about children. Cuts the deficit, and this is one that we can all come together and support. Why? Because it's for our kids. It's for the kids across America who need a home. I mentioned two of my grandchildren who are foster children. Were foster children, are now adopted, but they were even more special. They were drug-addicted babies. Crack cocaine, heroin, and meth. And these kids today have a home. And as a grandparent standing on the sidelines of a soccer game, watching Emma and Briar play soccer, knowing where they came from, the moms lived on the streets, drug-addicted moms. These kids have hope. They have a future. When the game is over, they run to the sidelines and they yell, "Papa." It's the greatest feeling in the world. We owe that kind of life to every foster child. I yield back.
The remainder of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3205? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and
Mr. Speaker, on that I would request the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12 of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until approximately 6:30 p.m. today.